Hello there, my name's Annette with Sunbeam FPP and Sunbeam Fabric Arts. I ran across a 1951 Ford Falcon. The owner told me I could take a picture and make a pattern out of it, and I did that, and here is what we've got. This pattern, now that it's tested, is available on my Etsy shop. I'll leave a link in the description. What you're seeing here is the pattern before it was ready for publishing. I had a lot of changes and notes to put on this pattern, and that has been done, and the pattern is now listed. Now I printed out 2 copies because I want to make this pattern in a blue car, but I wanted to make the first one in green because the owner of the car said, hey, if you make this, can you send it to me? So I made it in green first, and I'm going to get it to the owner, and then I'm going to make it in blue sometime in the future, but there's no rush on the blue car. Here are the colors I'm going to need to make my car. I need a light, medium, and dark green to make a green car. Whatever color car you want to make, you're going to need a light, medium, and a dark. Then I'm using black for the windows of the car, white for the outlines and the white wall on the tire. And then I've got a light gray and a dark gray. The light gray and the dark gray are used in the tires. And then the light gray also is the street in the blue car, and it's the street and entire background for the green car, the way I'm going to make it. On a printed pattern like this, it's really hard to tell the difference between the white and the light gray, for example. So what I like to do is go through my entire pattern and write down what colors go on which pieces. So that is something I highly recommend. This pattern is very advanced, and I wanted to point out something to you. There are several pieces of this medium green that I'm going to be making here, but the reason I have multiple lines there and multiple pieces for this one section is because I am following the lines of the car. I want those seams on the car to actually be seams on my fabric. And here is a look at how I have written the colors on this tire section. I've got W for white, D for dark gray, black, light gray, and then I've got the green shaded. It's the medium green that I'm going to need for that section. The first thing I'm going to do is cut apart all the pieces. I do have some of the sections that overlap more than one page. These 3 sections overlap the page, and the program prints a line that's your matching line. So what I'm going to do is cut that line right up along that line with a zigzag or a curvy, wavy line. Then I'll be able to just overlap this with the next sheet, and they should all match up. Once that matching line is laid out correctly, I can line that up nicely and then just put some tape on these pieces, and then I'll be able to cut these sections apart. Now we'll take a look at the fabrics that I picked out for the blue and for the green car. I've got my black, I've got my dark gray, and I've got my light gray. Now my light gray, I'm trying to use the same fabric for the street. So I've got this dark gray, it's Moda Grunge, basic gray, I think, and then the lighter shade on the right. I've been using that one, that light shade, for all my cars so far. I want to keep using that because sometime I might want to take all my finished cars and make a quilt. I picked out a light, medium, and dark blue for the blue car, and then on the blue car I also need my sky fabric, which is Midas Touch in teal. I've been using that for the sky on all my cars, and hopefully being consistent with that will make a nice quilt. I had these solids in my stash, and they are just the right shades for this car. The bright green car and the light green for the accent and the dark green for the shadowing. I will talk a little bit about cutting out the pattern pieces. I cut a strip of my white fabric, and I know I just need some small pieces for the white wall on the tire, and then I need some light gray pieces and some dark gray and black and some of the main car color. The most important thing to remember if you are trying to figure out what size you need, lay your fabric wrong side up to make sure it covers the piece that you need. I cut my pieces plenty big with extra seam allowance, plenty of extra seam allowance around the edges. And I try to cut out my pieces in order of numbers. Well, my pieces don't have numbers yet. They do in the finished pattern on my Etsy shop, but I went ahead and jotted down the piece numbers real quick so I could keep my little pieces in order. So I need my middle piece, which is a gray for the center of the tire. Then I need some white pieces for the white wall, and then some gray pieces for the tire and some black. I'm only making the green car today, but since I was cutting out the pieces, I cut out all the pieces for both cars in one sitting, and that way when I'm ready to make the blue car, the pieces are already cut out, ready to go in order in a box, so this is going to be great for me. Now I've got my pieces stacked up with the pattern on top, and those are ready to go, ready to make that section. Here are all the pieces for the blue car. I've placed them in this small box and put a little padding in there in case the box gets tipped over. They won't get too mixed up. But I've also got all the pieces for my green car cut out and ready to go. I've got my stitch length on my machine set to 1.3, and I'm going to use this foot, this presser foot, that gives me the ability to see what I'm doing, and I can get the paper and the bulky seams under the machine. I've got my iron ready to go because I am going to be pressing after each addition. I am not going to make an 8-hour video and show you the whole process of putting this car together. I will give you somewhat of an idea of how long it took me, and I think it was about 8 hours, but I'll double check and let you know for sure in the description. I'm going to start with pieces 1 and 2, and I'm going to put those right sides together on the back of this paper. And I want to make sure that the line between piece 1 and 2 is going to be overlapped with some seam allowance. I'm going to stitch on that line, open up the seam, and trim away the excess bulk. So I can see that my pieces do overlap that seam line, and I'm going to go ahead and stitch that line with my 1.3 stitch length. After every addition, I do always try to trim away those excess threads. I didn't used to. My first few paper piecing projects I didn't, but then I would get those threads caught up in my finished quilt and it would be hard to get them out. So now I trim those threads every time. Then I'm going to fold my paper on that line that I just stitched, trim away that excess bulk, and press that seam open. Now I'm going to add the next piece, which is going to be 3. I'm going to put that right sides together with the fabric on the back. I'm going to make sure that it overlaps that stitch line, and it also covers, it will cover piece 3 once I fold it open. And again, I'm going to trim away the threads. Then I'm going to fold the paper on the line I just stitched. I'm going to trim away that excess bulk from the seam. And then I'll fold that open and press it flat. One little tip with lighter fabrics, if you have a lamp or a light box, you can usually see where your fabric is and see if it's going to overlap your stitch line. A lot of the fabrics I use for paper piecing, though, are dark, so that doesn't work for those fabrics. I'm going to keep working my way around this tire, first with the white, then with the gray, then with the black and light gray, and finally I'm going to be adding the car color, the green. Here you see I've added the first piece of the gray, that is the tire, and I'm going to go ahead and continue around adding the gray for the tire. And here it is. That was fast. I need to add some light gray on one side of the tire and some black on the opposite side of the tire. And every piece gets added the same way. I'm making sure the piece is big enough to cover the piece, and then I'm putting it right sides together on the back, making sure I have a seam allowance overlapping the stitch line, and that when I fold it open, it will cover the piece I'm trying to cover. Here's how that looks after adding those 3 pieces of black and the 3 pieces of light gray. Next, I'll be adding some pieces of light green, medium green, dark green, light green again. I've got my pieces laid out on the left over there, and I'm going to continue adding them one at a time, making sure I have my seam allowance overlapping the stitch line. Then I'll trim away the threads, fold back the paper, trim away the excess bulk, press that seam open. When you're stitching a foundation paper pieced pattern, you want to stitch about 2 to 3 stitches before the actual stitch line and about 2 to 3 stitches afterwards. That is going to keep your seam in place and not let it come apart on you. Now these medium green additions are pretty straightforward. I am going to skip ahead on this just a little bit. One thing you might run into is your paper tearing. I'm using just regular copy machine paper here, and yeah, my paper is starting to tear a little bit because there are so many seams going through this paper. I'm just going to take a little tape and stick that paper back together. I want to make sure it stays all together at least until I can cut out the piece. I have skipped ahead and I'm going to show you all of the pieces here that I've stitched on. I am ready to trim this piece. You can see there are some very tiny pieces, but as long as you just keep sewing on those lines, it is going to work out. You may have some bulky seams, and that's okay too. That's just part of intricate advanced paper piecing. When you cut a section out on the dotted lines, I use a ruler sometimes, but on a small piece like this with lots of seams, I just cut it out with my scissors. And some of the corners will have notches, and that will help you line up pieces with other pieces. Foundation paper piecing with this level of tininess also tends to have a bit more waste than a normal project, just because it's so much easier if you cut your piece 3 times as big as you need. It's just better, it makes it go faster. I have tried to cut these tiny pieces with only the seam allowance, and that just never works out for me. Here I've skipped ahead again, and I'm giving you a look at the second section that has a tire in it, and it's still got the green for the car and the black for underneath the car. That's kind of the shadow of the car, and the light gray is the background of the block. Here is that section we talked about at the beginning where I could have done less pieces of the green, but I wanted those lines to be there because that mimicked the lines of the actual car pieces. Here's another section with the same thing. I could have made this section a little bit easier, but I really did want those lines to be there to mimic the actual lines of pieces of the car, the door, the roof, the line between the doors. I wanted you to know I do use a cutting mat, a nice big ruler, and a rotary cutter to cut out bigger pieces. I don't want that fabric flopping around if I try to cut it with scissors. Now we've skipped ahead again. I have laid out all the finished and trimmed pieces here, and now I have to make my pattern, I've got to figure out what is the order these pieces need to go together. So I've got it laid out, and I'm going back and forth between this and my computer, writing down the actual instructions that will go in the pattern. I've got this little table behind me. I've got my iron and mat ready to go because, again, once I stitch 2 pieces together, I'm probably going to need to press them. I'm going to keep my stitch length 1.3 if I'm sewing with paper. Once I take that paper off, I try to change the stitch length to 2. These are small pieces, so I don't want to go too big. I'm putting my first 2 pieces right sides together, and I'm going to stitch right on that stitch line and join these pieces. I'll use clips where I need to hold everything in place. And when I start joining the sections, I am sewing from the edge of paper to the other edge of the paper. I'm getting ready to sew a third piece on the back of the 2 I just stitched. I am going to pull out some of this paper from around that seam, and the reason is I don't want to get paper caught up in between many seams. So it's better for me to pull some of this paper or all of this paper away from the seam before I stitch on it again. Here is a look at the top half of the block. I've got the top of the car. You can see the hood, the windows, the that triangle window in the front of the car, and then the back window. Those are outlined. And now here I'm adding the bottom of the car, and I'll be able to just put these last 2 groups together, and that will complete my block. And here is the look at that finished block. If we talk about feelings, I've got a lot of feelings about foundation paper piecing. I am always nervous when I start. Not nervous, I guess. I just know how much work it's going to be, and You always wonder if it's going to turn out right, but if you just keep plugging away and just stitching on those lines and follow the directions, it's going to come out great. Even if there are a couple of little tiny seams that don't quite match up, usually you can wiggle a little bit and get them to, get them to fit in where you need them to fit. Everything is forgiven once it is in a quilt or bound in a project, but just looking at it first blush, it's just beautiful. This car is great. As a surprise ending, I am going to put a picture in here of the actual car that I used to create this pattern. I was at a retreat up in Hamilton, Missouri, and we walked to the post office to get some postcard stamps so I could send postcards to my grandchildren. And this car was right across the street from the post office. I had to take a picture, but then of course I had to go inside the business and ask who the owner was and get permission to make this pattern. And he was all about it. He was a very nice older gentleman and said, just, if you make it, just send it to me. I did take a little creative license with the white wall tires, but I like it. And I think what I'm going to do is go ahead and quilt it and then frame it and send that off to Mr. Mac. Thanks so much for joining me today. I hope to see you back next time.